All right, welcome back everyone to the FPL Script. This is season 2, episode 35, and we're going to quickly start off with our Gameweek 36 review before we jump into the discussion for Gameweek 37. Ultimately, I got 123 points. I'm your co-host, Fran, FPL__Fran on Twitter. I got very lucky because I kept a certain player called Flecken, who I made a lot of jokes about on the podcast throughout the season. But he's averaged out a lot of his sort of poor shot stopping. We've also indicated that Brentford have actually made a lot of mistakes, but clearly less so recently. And nice little remontada there, despite him being... He's actually probably the only pick within my Gaming 26 wildcard that's actually done well. Other than that, I think a lot of people had a lot of returns across the board. Me, as a non-wildcard 35er, got to keep triple Arsenal, and that's continued to sort of, pay off quite handsomely. I did make a lot of hits recently, and that was done last week, as I said, just to sort of hedge between a non-wildcard 35 approach with keeping Arsenal, but then also to make sure I have the doubles in place with Chelsea, Tottenham, even Newcastle, who just generally have good fixtures, and City. So this is the team that I ended up with. Got double Arsenal defense, Guardiola. I think it was a very fortunate own, of course. In the midfield, Saka, Foden, Gordon, Palmer, full house there. And then Isak, Jackson, Holland, with Holland captain as well, which was quite fortunate in terms of how things played out. What about you, JD?
Yeah, hi everyone. Glad to be back again after we've had these sort of mini breaks. So I hope this is the last one because the next one is going to be a pretty long break. So glad to be back. Just to go through my game week very quickly, Fran, if you can go to the next one.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So I also scored pretty well. Again, just like Fran benefited from Brentford defense, so did I. The only difference is that because of Region's yellow card, he gained a point and I lost a point because otherwise Region would have gotten 3 bonus points solo. So Brentford defense, I mean, I don't know. We spoke a lot about it that they have consistently been top half in terms of NPXGC. So glad to see that they are keeping at least some clean sheets.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, Arsenal clean sheet was the most fortuitous one. I don't even care that much. I mean, I do care about the Guardiola thing, but I am more peeved about the Arsenal clean sheet because it should really have stood. The goal should have stood, and everyone thinks so. It's not just non or just single defense owners. I mean, everyone thinks so. But again, it's just it is what it is. Every single attacker returned, and I think that is the case for you as well, Fran, if I'm not wrong, which is great.
Yeah.
So apart from Dan Burn, and there's a whole saga related to Dan Burn, which a certain group chat is privy to, and it was really fun when Burnley scored, but people thought that Dan Burn had scored. So that's something to cherish for this game week. But yeah, we can move on to discussion points for double game week 37.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, this week's xMins discussions, I think, are probably the most prevalent. Just given that I think it has an impact on, first of all, how you play Gaming 38 as well. So I think without even diving into Gaming 37, the first thing to point out is that, ultimately, whatever transfers you make this week is going to have a knock-on impact on how set up you are, I suppose, to deal with whatever can come out with Gaming 38. Although I also think that in terms of how alive a lot of the top teams are this season, how many home fixtures there are as well. I think we're in a very fortunate spot, to be honest, where your teams like Chelsea still have something to fight for on paper right now. So I think when you make transfers, probably you don't have to keep such an open mind to two free transfers in Game Week 38. And sometimes I think the swings are so ridiculous in Game Week 38 if we get to find out news on the deadline that, it's always going to be worth a hit no matter what, right? If you find out that someone spectacular is benched. So in a way, obviously, there is a lot of, value just to be gained this week. So even before we touch on Game Week 37 as well, I think it's just worth recognizing, what is your upside this week versus what is your upside next week, and whether you can, for example, leave a little bit of room to take account into things that right now you can't predict, which will inevitably happen. But as I said, fortunately, because a lot of the big teams have something to play for, or at least playing at home, which arguably is, a subset of that anyways, it's nice. And fortunately, I probably don't have to make too many decisions. I think another thing too about planning a bench boost so close out to getting 38 is hopefully we would have a lot of players that we can
Exactly.
swap
Even if
between,
someone
right?
misses out, exactly. That's right. Yeah.
Exactly. So you can call upon option like someone like Anthony Gordon, who I imagine a lot of people won't want to play for Gaming 38. You know, you just have him on the bench, and I think that's totally cool.
Yeah.
But the first discussion we wanted to talk about is someone who has not been pictured in training, and we know obviously teams over the course of the season, I think, have become a lot smarter about not showing injury related information. So there's that element, but then there's also the element of United also showing that two players have come back to training, right? I think Rashford and Lisandro Martinez. So I suppose the concern is around Bruno Fernandes, who a lot of people do own, and we don't own Bruno, I believe. So this is more of a wildcard 35 type problem, or unfortunately for the people who made the move, 2 weeks ago, maybe to move away from an Arsenal midfielder, you're kind of dealing with this situation once again with Bruno. I think that the logical situation is to deal with him by simply, obviously waiting for the press conference tomorrow. But let's see if we don't get positive news on Bruno. You can probably look at actually going for Richarlison if you don't have triple Spurs. But I suppose the question that's even tougher is for managers who don't have triples, or managers who do have
Who
triple
have,
Spurs
yeah.
already. Like, what would you do in that situation?
So first of all, as a United fan, this concerns me greatly, not just from an FPL perspective for anyone who wants to understand what to do with Bruno Fernandes, but just in general because him missing out. So, for example, the famous incident where he was his wife posted a photo of a cast that he was wearing, and he ended up playing in the next game. So we have always known that there has been no secrecy when it comes to someone like Bruno Fernandes, or in general. I mean, United team news has been so leaky. Our United dressing room has been leaky for years now. It's not even like it's a secret. Dean Henderson was one of the leakers. He left the club. The leak sort of reduced. So we still get news from time to time, or more often than not. So I don't understand what's happening. I'm assuming that they are trying to, maybe, I don't know, but maybe keep it secret for the FA Cup final or something, which it's really weird because United are eighth right now, and if there is any chance of us finishing in top seven, which is what you need right now for European spots, I don't see how we can afford to lose even a single game. I mean, I know that it's not in our hands. If we play Casemiro and Johnny Evans, we will lose. There is no two ways about it. So anyway, that's sort of a digression. But coming back to the main topic, I would look at moving him on, honestly speaking, because I think the fact that there is no news is perhaps bad, because normally no news is no news, right? It's
Yeah.
you are actually waiting for the manager to tell you something. But I'll give a caveat. If Tenak ends up saying something which is crystal clear in either direction, fine, you can make the decision based on that. But if he says nothing, or if he's very coy about it, I don't know what to how to interpret that, because I believe he is clueless. Yes, that's not unclear, I think, by now. So I'm just going to ask people to, if they have the luxury, then move him on. As Fran has already pointed out, the easiest move is obviously to someone like Richarlison if you have the third Spurs slot. But if you don't, here's the interesting thing. I have seen a lot of people who have either punted with Richarlison and so they have three Spurs, or they have Anthony Gordon. I have
Mm,
yet to see people who have both Anthony Gordon and Richarlison, as well as, because Palmer and who's the fourth one? Son are locked. Right? So you are really left with three spots that you're looking at. So I'm assuming most people won't have Anthony Gordon. So if you are one of those unlucky ones who's gone with double defense, Newcastle defense, you obviously must have share. So you can do share to someone, another defender, and then do Bruno Fernandes to Richarlison.
mm.
Sorry, Gordon. So I think that sounds like a good plan to be in terms of covering, a robust 90-minute player. Or do you have some thoughts on this?
I think so. So a pretty prototypical wildcard midfield is something like Bruno, Foden, Son, Palmer, and Gordon.
Foden. That was the fifth one. Yes,
Yeah.
Foden. Yeah.
But then I guess unfortunately you probably have to go to someone like Saka at this point is the way I see it. Because I believe Saka's expected value is very close to gross anyways. So of
Yeah.
all the sort of doubling midfielders, you probably don't want to actually go anywhere else. There is Madueke, though, I will say. I think he's probably the one pick that is probably the most exciting. So, I think, yeah, either you go Gordon, you go Foden, or you go Madueke. But if you're tripled up on all those teams, as you mentioned, it's really, I think you just have to go for Saka,
Yes.
unfortunately. And you have to sort of hope for the best in terms of what Saka's minutes will look like for the next 2 weeks. Or the same case if you can only really go to, let's say, Havertz, for example, if you let's say, can't afford Saka. And then I suppose the other situation is you don't have triple city, and somehow you've got room and money in the bank to go De Bruyne. That's probably an even more comfortable option, right? Because right now, with the way West Ham are looking too, like Man City expected value for Gameweek 38 just seems incredible. Um, so,
So just to close out the xMins discussion, I think
mm,
I would have Bruno's xMins right now as something like 10 and 60.
right. Which is nice,
Something of
anyways, in terms of how the
yeah.
fixtures pan out for United, because obviously you play Arsenal first.
Yes.
But then I think the question is, yeah, like, is there a move? Because United, actually, another thing to point about Bruno too is that I think there's a lot of value in just selling Bruno anyways, if you really think that that's the case, because your fixture in Game Week 38 is an away from home fixture as well, and it's not particularly easy, I would say, even though we have seen a pretty bad version of Brighton recently. So that's the only thing I'd mention. It just seems like it would be worth still spending that transfer right.
So I mean, I know this is again a one game sample size, but Brighton considered 0.05 xg
Yep,
to Villa.
0.06, yeah.
0.06, and so I'm assuming that that's more down to Villa not being good rather than Brighton being exceptional
I'd
all
say
of a
so.
sudden.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen Brighton quite a fair bit. Uh,
Yeah.
I think Chase also posted his rolling numbers for April, and
Yes.
and Brighton were comfortably bottom five, I think, in defensive sort of rolling
Okay.
team
So
rankings. Yeah.
that just backs up what you have already argued on the timeline, which is that Aston Villa have sort of dropped off, and
Hmm.
which is to be expected because they are not used to European competitions, and this was a pretty hectic campaign for them,
Yeah. And in a
and they
way
got
too, like if you really want to be emotional about these sort of arguments, I guess Spurs haven't really given them much of a reason to care
fair
about
enough
the league. You want to
complacency.
put it like
That's
that?
a good
Yeah.
yeah, that's a good argument actually, and difficult to quantify, but at the same time, if it pans out that way, it's easy to point to that as one of the possible reasons, right? Because they are not threatened by, and also they can't get to anywhere but fourth because
Yeah.
Liverpool are that much ahead of them. So it's that's a solid argument, I think. So perhaps you can use this to move on to the next midfielder, which is also quite a pain point for me, and that is James Maddison. Um, I have written an ode to James Maddison a couple of weeks ago when he was benched for the first time. Because look, I was one of those who was openly mocking my own decision, or I was mocking my own sort of how shall I say tragedy. But at the same time, I was never expected him to actually be benched
Right.
because I kept thinking, okay, he's just going to like keep playing him for 60 minutes till one game it clicks. He starts showing something which is reminiscent of James Madison, and then it'll be okay. And unfortunately, it's gone completely the wrong way. Also because everyone is back fit again. So the midfield that is. So he's been benched for the past couple of games, and one of the hypotheses that I saw on the timeline was that the only reason he's expected to be back is Fran pointed out to me before we started this stream, which is that benching him 3 games in a row seems unreasonable in a sense. Again, this is a very
Grassy.
emotional and grassy argument.
Yeah.
And the other one is that apparently Spurs looked better when he came out,
Mm.
which could easily be a result of Richarlison and not more so about Maddison, because Richarlison really did get in among things and got a goal and an assist. So I have really have no idea how to interpret that, but I'm going to trust someone like Adam. I really don't know his Twitter handle, but he is one of the best Spurs predictors, and he's saying that Madison will most likely start against Burnley, which is the game I want him for anyway. So if he
Yeah.
starts against Burnley, fine. Now I want to ask you a question: would you do Madison to Richarlison in my position? Because that is, I think, a question that many people have for a -4. That too, it's not a free transfer. That
Yeah.
is.
I don't think I'd do it for -4. I
Yes.
think you make a good argument about So I mean, I was obviously listening to Ange recently, and I think what he said is that Richarlison obviously wasn't going to play the Liverpool game because due to sort of building up match fitness and coming back from an injury, there was no way he was going to start 2 games back to back.
Mm,
Now,
mm,
yeah, I think even if you let's say ran Richarlison's minutes like really high and you expected him to start 3 games in a row, I just don't think that playing 25 minutes or let's say I don't know 65 minutes versus Man City is a huge difference for how we evaluate Richarlison. So it all comes down to whether Maddison plays versus Burnley to me. And I think because he plays versus Burnley, it's not really worth a -4. And that's sort of how I see it. Maybe, of course, if you think that Maddison could, put himself into a situation where if he, let's say, plays poorly versus Burnley, I don't know, he could be benched, twice in a row again. I guess you just make that decision game week 38. I would much rather stick with Maddison for this week. And that's only because it's a -4. As I said, I think if you don't have any issues in your team, you've got more luxury than that, then yeah, I would definitely go Maddison to Richarlison like easily. But I think a lot of people have other issues to deal with, and that's Bruno related or defender related as well, and it's tough. But Richarlison's EV does look very good. One thing I'll mention too, though, is that review has been consistently very high on Richarlison's EV,
yeah.
probably a little bit more aggressively than market. And I don't think that's necessarily pen share, but maybe just evaluation, I suppose, of the center forward minutes as well. And I think also in a way, right, when you look at spreads, there is I guess like an implication of the benching sort of being priced in as well, I suppose. So there's that too.
Yeah,
But
that's an interesting segue because Richarlison is, I think, also one of those xMins players that we are trying to estimate how many xMins he'll get.
yeah,
So I'll just tell people like what I have his xMins at when I'm solving. So right now I have Maddison at something like 70, 30, and then 60.
mm-hmm.
And for Richarlison, I have 70, 40, and then 65. And the only reason I have the other game as 40 is because I'm sort of weighing up possibility of a start again and how many minutes you would get off the bench. So it's sort of an amalgamation of the two. Now, the right way to do this is obviously, we've spoken about this many a times before. You need to solve them separately, assuming a start. So 70, 70, 65, and then not assuming a start, which would be something like 70, 20, and then 65. And then you go with the two sensitive analyses, and then the combined result of those two will give you what moves you should make. But if you don't have that much time, you can go for a weighted approach, which is sort of the lazy approach, and it works most of the time, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. But ultimately, like the change, I suppose, within your evaluation of the minutes there, it's just on the City game. But like, is that substantial?
Oh
Like,
yeah, fair point.
yeah,
Fair point. Fair point. Yeah, I think the only difference is going to be appearance points there.
no, that's true. And I think
Yeah.
the key thing is as well is whenever you look at the ceiling, I suppose theoretically of any of these players, it's like I think one thing to point out about Maddison really is that he doesn't seem like he's ever going to hit the upper thresholds, right? So like when you like undershoot Richarlison's minutes, I think one of the things too is, and I like doing this myself, is when you go for a player and let's say you're being a little bit pessimistic, like I think actually 70 for Richarlison feels like a pessimistic take on his Burnley minutes because you're almost implying that he's going to get subbed off a little bit early, maybe for playing poorly or whatever. But yeah, like I think if he plays well, he's the type of player where he can easily play like 85 minutes or 88 minutes. Whereas Maddison, with his recent minutes, you have to say he's like honestly playing within the ranges of like 25 to 68, something like that, right? Is like his acceptable range of minutes right now. So yeah, I feel like even if you're using the minutes that you're doing, you're being quite selective with Richarlison, and I get that as well. But I think with Richarlison, one thing I have to mention is there's a lot more potential for upside if you do go for him, even with cautious minutes, because you can probably get rewarded more so than let's say Maddison. So I don't envy anyone owning Maddison, to be honest. It feels like, first of all, it doesn't seem like he's just generally playing well, and you can see that, I suppose, through the data too.
Yeah.
And of course, how his coach is evaluating how many minutes he should play. But yeah, that's something to point out. I did also listen to Angie's press conference where he was specifically asked the question about, did Richarlison completely change the Liverpool game? And I think he did he didn't really put anyone under the bus. So he was pretty clear, I think, throughout the whole match that he was happy with, their performance versus Liverpool overall, even before the substitutions. But obviously that Richarlison did quote unquote help the team. So yeah,
Oh, that's fair. Yeah.
it's interesting.
No, I was going to say that you point out an interesting sort of approach, which is that you either put his Burnley minutes at 80 plus, and then you use 20 or something
Mm,
to as a proxy for his benching against Man City.
maybe, yeah.
So I understand where you're coming from in terms of you either boost his minutes against Burnley, or if you want to keep his minutes around 70, then you need to boost his minutes against Man City, because that would imply that he has been rested plenty, and there is a decent likelihood that he would start again.
Yeah.
So yeah, that actually makes sense.
Yeah, that's an interesting one because obviously I think like in the midfield right now we are sort of spoiled for choice still, but then people are mostly restricted by things like price points and unfortunately like how blocked they are by triple ups, right? So
Yes.
ultimately it comes down to whether you have room to go for one of the picks that we talked about, even in the Bruno segment, like your Maduekes of the world,
Hmm.
because obviously it doesn't feel so good. Like if you had to go Maddison to Saka, like how boring is that? I probably would just persist with Maddison versus Burnley and call it a day there, if I was honest. So the last sort of midfield xMins discussion segment is just the idea that we sort of postulate at the start, but in the form of an actual player. So game week 38, captaincy. I think Salah he might be the best captain. Maybe Son might be the best captaincy. It really depends on how you evaluate Salah's minutes, right? Because we have seen Salah play fewer minutes than we'd expect in recent memory. I think Klopp has obviously mentioned that things are all fine now. And another point to mention too is Man City are playing versus West Ham at home. So, I think if you believe that Haaland can start there, let's be honest, I think the captaincy is still going to sway towards Haaland. But I think even the idea of just having, I guess, Salah on Gaming 38 is going to be a differential because the way that we are all allocating our funds right now, particularly with the bench boost in mind for the managers who have it, and I think 85% of the top 10K, top 100K have the bench boost left. So
Hmm.
to me, it feels like you're more than likely not going to carry forwards someone like Salah to the bench boost. If you have room to go Salah in Game 38, he will be differential no matter what. What do you think about the value of that? And like how seriously should some managers who maybe have the capacity to do that think about that in their transfer plans?
So I think the bench boost stat is interesting because 85% is almost the entire field.
That's crazy, yeah.
So that's actually crazy because I don't think we've ever had, even though a lot of people have come from different strategies, like for example, you and me have come from different strategies.
Yeah.
The meta wildcard 35 is a different strategy, but all of us are bench boosting in 37. So I've seen almost all the teams that I've seen do not have the funds or the luxury to go to Salah,
Yeah.
as you've already pointed out. So for me, because all the team news are going to come in, or all the team leaks are going to come in around the same time, I would actually place a lot of value on those, and obviously waiting till we get them. But I'm assuming Salah starts based on just the general feel of Klopp's final game.
Yeah.
And as soon as I had an interesting, not a discussion, but there was an interesting discussion going on Discord about what squad will Man City play if the league is won in the second game of Game Week 37
Yeah.
for Man City. And I believe that they will not field a weak team this time around because every single title they've won has either been on the last day itself, or they've won it quite in advance, which means that they've had all the time in the world to party and for players to miss out, which is what happened when I believe they showed up a pretty hungover last season. So I don't think they're going to do that. So your point about them playing West Ham has to be pretty much at the top of your consideration, because again, and we'll come to the captaincy discussion. We have some discussion around risk planned as well. But I think game week 38 captaining Salah over Holland is a better risk, or not a better risk, but I think I would take that risk more than I would take a risk of captaining someone other than Holland in this double game week. Let's put it that way.
Interesting.
Assuming that both of them start, because I think Wolves is just a great fixture. So I'm assuming the EV is pretty close, and we can have a look next week when we stream what their EVs are. But if you want to plan like that, so I tried planning accordingly. So I used the solver to book in a move for Salah in for, let's say, Maddison. But
Hmm.
unfortunately, there's too much sacrifice needed for my team. So as much as I want to bring him in, I think I'll have to stick to Saka, and that's going to be pretty much everyone's move, except for someone like you who already owns Saka, so you have the luxury to plan a different move. But most of us who don't own Saka are probably going to buy Saka in 38, I think.
That's fair.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think what's nice too for people who can't go for Saka is you've still got hopefully Havertz on the wings.
Ah,
So
yes,
I can see a
yes.
lot of managers who, are in that sort of Bruno price point, who have basically spent as much money as possible across the field for their bench boost. You still have that insurance clause of Havertz, which is really nice, I would have to say. Pretty jealous of managers who can just do that. At the same time, in terms of, good expenditure of cash, there is a really cheap player, obviously. His name is Joao Pedro. Um, as I said in the podcast for many weeks now, I think that he is clearly Brighton's best player, attacking wise. Some people will probably say Adingra after watching the Aston Villa match, but the reality, I think, is for the better part of this last half of the season, when he's not been injured, I think you've already seen that De Zerbi has basically waxed lyrical about him. And since he's been match fit, João Pedro has basically played 80, 89, 90 minutes every game. And I don't see that changing because, well, first of all, unfortunately, the sort of players at De Zerbi's disposal are the likes of Lallana and Jakob Moder and so on and so forth. But yeah, I mean, João Pedro has perfect minutes. He's someone that I think for the last few weeks, if I'm being honest, and particularly for the Wildcard 35 crowd, I'll shout out Konate as well, because he did actually go João Pedro in his draft. And I think if you've been looking at his minutes and you've considered him as a good pick, like he's always he's a great option because that he also gets to play United at home, Gaming 38. Um, and I think that's quite appetizing for some people to go for now, particularly since we already know that the defense is in tatters, although Lissandro's obviously back in training. But I really don't see that changing too much, right? Like I don't
But
think
again,
he's.
I know people keep talking about that, but if you look at, and it's maybe not fair to Lisandro Martinez,
Mm,
but it's not as if he's made a huge difference to the XGC
yeah,
of United. It's more of his ball progression and how we play as a team where his absence is felt. But as far as defending is concerned, I just think the whole setup is pretty bad. And even if Lisandro is back, I would back someone like Joao Pedro to definitely do well against us. So, and he is definitely on penalties, which cannot be said about Isaac now, because he missed his previous
well,
penalty.
so did João
Oh,
Pedro.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. But that's actually a fair point. But I don't think Gross is likely to take penalties from him as
Hmm.
much as Callum Wilson is, because Jack Bones on Discord pointed this out to me that Callum Wilson said this on the Wilson and Antonio podcast when Antonio was still part of the podcast, that he would. I think they were talking about the Arsenal penalty sharing situation,
Yeah, I remember that.
and Callum Wilson said that he would never ever give a penalty to anyone else when
Although
he is on the
he
pitch.
did though, right?
He
Which
did,
is
but
yeah.
I'm saying that him giving up a penalty and then someone missing, I think further vindicates his previous stance.
Mm,
So I just feel like that makes it even less likely that he would give it up. Also because Holland has scored four and is now so far ahead of someone like Isaac
true.
that
That's a good point,
is
actually.
he?
I guess the Golden Boot
Yeah.
argument's somewhat
Yes.
in the mud. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And so I just believe that that further muddies the situation with someone like Isaac. Now I went for Isaac over Joao Pedro firmly because of expected value.
Yeah.
But if you want to risk it, I think Joao Pedro is a great differential risk because he plays Man United and he plays Newcastle United, whose defense is also pretty much not first choice at all.
Yeah, I think that that's a fair point, right? Because ultimately, Isak, if you think he's a 90-minute player, which he has been for a long time now,
Yes.
um, it's not really that close. But I guess it would be a little bit closer if you were someone who had, I suppose, maybe the capacity to do a little something a little crazy like the Salah move that we talked about. So if
Mm.
that's on the cards for you, I think it's interesting, right? We have a discussion. at that point.
So
But
maybe you want to put this up on your account because you are likely to get more responses. But Salah plus Pedro
mhm.
versus Isaac plus Saka.
Interesting. It's a good question.
Because yeah, same number of games, four penalty takers. Right now,
Yeah.
Isaac is a little muddy, but for now, let's assume four penalty takers.
Yeah.
And it's going to be an interesting discussion or discourse.
Yeah. Do you have any idea whether review might have adjusted Isaac's penalty share? You know what? What's
I would,
interesting is I think previously
yeah,
maybe review had it Wilson over Isaac, and now
I thought both those things. That
yeah,
maybe there is no need to adjust because it always was geared towards Wilson, and now I think it's again geared towards Wilson. So I think review must not have changed anything. If
fair.
if you're
That's what
being
I'm
honest.
thinking too. Because I mean, another thing to point out too is Wilson doesn't really determine who takes the penalties. I suppose if you do believe that Eddie Howe still has authority over the team, right? That
Yeah.
must be how Isaac got the penalty last match, anyways. You know,
One more discussion point. Sorry to cut in, but
mhm.
one more discussion point is: do we think that Callum Wilson starts both games? Because that also obviously impacts Isaac's penalty share, right?
Yeah, I feel like I'm gonna say probably yes, to be honest.
Okay.
But I think we'll continue to see maybe early substitutions. And, either way, I think back and forth, you'd probably see Wilson play more than 90 minutes over the next two matches. So yeah, I'm not that concerned about Isaac. And I think that the thing is too, it's like you also have to really believe it if you're only pushing for an Isaac captaincy. Or are we talking about also the idea of going for Wilson um, as
Ooh,
a forward?
I had thought about it
Mm,
because this is the exact same situation that I was in last season.
yeah,
Because Fran was absolutely flying as he is this season. But I was in a conundrum where I had a chance to go for a risky pick like Wilson because
I
again
remember.
Isaac
Yeah,
was massively owned and Formadillo went for Wilson and he benefited massively because of that. So I didn't, and I think from that incident, kept that in the back of my mind that I need to do a sense check. Obviously, I am in a great position this year, unlike last year, so I don't need to go searching for mega differential picks. But again, Wilson was one of those. My only concern has always been his minutes, and that sort of has been vindicated, right? Because he did get subbed in the previous game as well.
yeah, he did get subbed
So
early, but
yeah,
part of that too is maybe just a continual build up of match fitness.
yes,
Yeah,
yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, but I think getting more minutes against Burnley was part of the expected value gain, and
yes.
so Isaac was always going to win in that case for me.
No, that's a good point. And I think the biggest thing too is a lot of people did think that Isaac would either positionally get destroyed by Wilson or, minutes wise get destroyed by Wilson. And actually none of those things have,
Yeah,
you know, borne
yeah,
fruit. So I think it's so much tougher to argue for Wilson to join as part of your three forwards um, than it was last season when it was very obvious that Isaac would just be a left winger or potentially even get subbed off early. Because if you remember last season, on the second game of the double game week, we had
we get
Isaac with very
yes,
limited minutes for the same reason.
yes, yes,
And
yes.
and it really doesn't seem like that's ever going to be the case. Maybe I'm wrong, but we'll see. Cool. So that's our discussion in terms of forwards. Hold that thought though, about sort of, what you were doing last season in if you were, let's say, in a worse position. I think that's a very interesting discussion that we'll have later on when we talk captaincy and just in general approach, towards the end of the season, things like that. The last topic I wanted to discuss is obviously just the realm of defenders, right? There's the issues that we have so far for most managers, I believe, is the Maguire injury, the Van Heck injury, and also the Shaw injury. So just for an update for managers, I think Maguire is definitely out until the FA Cup, so
Yeah.
consider him a dead option. Shaw, we are probably awaiting an update from Eddie Howe because I think we've had conflicting reports, but I think I would say 80% Shaw is out once again, and I think he's going to miss out on one game for sure. So for me, he's also a dead option. And then with Van Heck, I believe we got reports that he's out for the season, but they weren't confirmed by anyone from Brighton or De Zerbi. So
Okay.
all those options I think are pretty far removed from being good options in Gameweek 37. So a lot of people are actually looking to transfer these players out. what do you let's just start with the price point of Maguire, because he's an interesting one. He's at 4.3 million, which means that you're only let's say if you're limited from a cash perspective to some very cheap players who have some on the surface very flimsy expected minutes, with exception to Webster in my opinion. What do you think about the replacements in terms of the cheap Newcastle options? I'll include Kraft here just to be fair. He's 4.4 million, so a little bit more expensive than Maguire. But let's just talk Kraft, Hall, Livermore. Like, what do you think about their expected minutes and your take on things?
Yeah, so an update from Eddie how the last time he spoke about Trippier, or was it just the Newcastle account? Someone reliable has
I
already
think
said that
Sky Sports
Trippier,
reported he's in full
yeah,
training. Yeah.
he's in full training. Exactly. So I just think that Livramento and Hall are both extremely affected as a result. And I think that makes none of them viable options, because you want at least a decent possibility that they get two starts. And I don't think that is going to be a decent possibility at all. That also merged Trippier, but that's a separate discussion point because he's extremely expensive compared to the options that we're discussing right now. The interesting one that I read was about Igor, because you spoke about Webster, right?
Yeah.
And Igor is of the same ilk, obviously. Um, I would be tempted to go for someone like him. Veltman was also a consideration, but he was recently left out for a game, if I'm not wrong. So, and there was no explanation why he was left out for one of the game.
Yeah, I think it was the game versus Bournemouth. Yeah.
Yes, yes, I think you're right about that. So again, I didn't delve deep into it, but as far as I could see, there was no explanation as to why he was left out, which could just mean it was a tactical decision. So if that's the case, I don't want to go for that. But Igor, I think, is an interesting one based depending on what Deserby says. I
And
think
it's, I guess, is Estupiñán out for the season?
he is,
Okay,
yes.
then yeah, Igor becomes your left back, hopefully.
Yeah, and what is it, Barco, right? What's the
Yeah,
left back?
Valentin Barco. Yeah.
Barco, yeah. So Barco also did not start the last game, so he is also a non-option. So that just makes Igor that much. I know that you should not expect any attacking returns from him. Although he get the assist for the gross goal that was ruled out? I think he did,
Yeah.
because I saw an update saying
No,
Igor
you're
assist.
right. Yeah, it was.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So maybe you can hope for some attacking return, but even if you don't, I am just looking for players who are going to play or start two games, and that is a very limited pool of players. So one of them is Igor, and I think Kraft is also a decent option, because even though he was subbed as a sub, I think he has had stable minutes since that game. Because Botman has been ruled out, Lascelles has been ruled out, so on and so forth. And I don't think they have competent replacements. Dermot is not a replacement that anyone is going to consider, because he came on against Everton and gave away a penalty instantly. So, based on the few minutes that he was on the pitch, I don't think he's going to take away Kraft's place. So, if you want to pick anyone out of those, I would definitely go for Emil Kraft. I don't know if you think differently.
I agree. And previously, I was thinking, I think obviously, as I said, Kraft is sort of cheating because he's more expensive than Maguire.
Yeah,
Obviously, I'd go
yeah,
Kraft first, but let's just
yeah,
like entertain the thought experiment. Like, what happens if you can't go Kraft and you're really restricted? So yeah, I think you can go for the Brighton options. I think they're probably safest. But then people like to think fullbacks too. And then I was thinking, obviously, maybe. Well, first of all, in terms of clean sheet odds, Newcastle have much better clean sheet odds than Brighton. So I understand the appeal of wanting to go for a Brighton fullback. And then another point I was thinking about too, though, is that if Newcastle are going to play 4-4-2, surely that's going to make the fullbacks slightly worse as well.
mm,
And that was something I was thinking about. And then in terms of how I think the estimation of Livramento and Hull has developed over the course of the season, I think there was a point in the season where particularly Livramento was playing exceptionally well in the FA Cup games. And so whenever Trippier was out, it always seemed like Livramento was, nailed to play, whether it was right wing,
yeah,
right back, or
yeah,
left back, even in place of Hull. But I think recently, because Hull has actually accumulated some pretty fair minutes, and he's played, well, not exceptional, but neither has Livramento, to be fair. I think that there is a world where Hull could easily start over Livramento if, let's say, Trippier comes back into the team, and it wouldn't surprise me. And that for me thinks or makes me lead towards going Hull if I really was going to gamble on a Newcastle defender. I'm this is just a thought experiment because obviously I guess I have the luxury of not having to make this decision. But yeah, I think I would lean Hull if I had to pick but one of them between Hull and Livermento. And yeah, as I said, I am a little bit fearful if they play 4-4-2. What really is the upside, anyways, of going for a Newcastle fullback? You're probably not even going to be a part of the set pieces, and how involved are you in attacking play? Besides maybe a
Yeah,
little bit of
and the
a
whole field tilt is not going to happen, right? Because
exactly, yeah. And it's like I
earlier in the
think people
season,
think
yeah,
Trippier, how good was he? But it's like even when we had Dan Burn, for example, like playing at left back, his threat was just set pieces. It's not like
yeah,
yeah, in terms of open play, it becomes anything interesting for the
yeah. But
fullbacks.
Livramento and Hall cannot do that, so I think you are right to be skeptical
Exactly.
about
Yeah.
their attacking prospects.
Right. So that's that discussion. The last discussion is going to be Spurs, but more specifically Pedro Porro, right? Because the leading defensive option for this week, just in terms of expected value alone, outside of the Man City defenders, which is cheating, by the way, is Pedro Porro. And I think for people who went on the wild card, he was a sort of absolute lock. And since then, we've seen some pretty awful Spurs defensive performances. And the interesting thing is that I've been tracking, for example, Spurs' EV over the course of this week, and I can guarantee that Porro's expected value has dropped at least 0.6, and that the markets have responded with the drop as well. And obviously, the clean sheet odds have dropped on review. So it isn't necessarily reflective of Porro as an attacking option, but more so specifically Spurs as a whole, and how we rate their defense. Now, someone like 11ify, obviously, I think he wrote an article 2-3 weeks back on the state of Spurs' defense, and it clearly wasn't a very good. I mean, it clearly wasn't a very good review of Spurs' defense. And since then, Spurs has only served to really prove him right. What do you think about just the general argument of how radically shifting, I suppose, the baselines are? And what do you think about Spurs' defense overall, as well as Porro, I suppose?
So we had this discussion, so I'm just going to sort of go through those points. This is really a two-parter for me,
Mm-hmm.
because the adjustment that a model goes through, if it is, let's say, waiting for more data to adjust baselines, I think review has waited for enough data to sort of shift the Spurs defense baselines to them not being a great defense. And that has to be a gradual shift, which would not be and what do you say, an ISO. It would be a gradual shift that slowly you would start seeing, maybe the solver asking you to transfer out your Spurs defender or something like that. But as Fran has seen, because Fran, is really keen into the EV that review has, so he immediately noticed that Spurs defense EV has massively dropped. And it's not just Pedro Porro, because Porro obviously always has the highest EV of all the Spurs defense. It
Yeah.
is everyone, including the likes of Romero, Van der Ven, and Emerson Royal.
I
So,
can
and
even say
because
just on the clean sheet odds versus Burnley alone, I've seen a shaving off of at least 7%. Um,
that's quite
yeah,
a radical difference, right? And so I come to the second part of the argument, which is that review also has a component of using market odds.
yeah,
And I think market has reacted quite aggressively,
hmm,
which makes me skeptical always. And I don't necessarily agree with the way in which these things are done. But I also think, okay, they are obviously uh, sort of reacting maybe late to a whole host of signals that have been pretty much present throughout the season, I think. And some of the clean sheets that Spurs have lost earlier in the season, like for example, the one they lost to Wolves late on, were pretty undeserved, I would say. Which is why when those things were happening, the models and the market were not reacting badly to it.
yeah,
But I think for the past couple of months, it has actually been, I would say, diabolical. Maybe diabolical is the word I would reserve for Sheffield United and Manchester United right now, but it's pretty close to that. So I definitely am sympathetic to people who own Spurs defense, because the planning you did was considering certain EV, and now that EV has dropped all of a sudden. And I'm assuming no one is going to react too radically to that, because what can you do? I mean, you still have to play them, right? There's no one is going to transfer them out because they suddenly lost one EV,
yeah,
because it's still one EV out of seven EV. So it's still a pretty great double game week for Spurs. So nothing is changing. Maybe game week 38 could change, because if you have the luxury of two free transfers, you could look at someone like maybe Trippier for Gameweek 38 to get in instead of Pedro Paulo. And that's a different discussion. I'm just making sure that I'm covering all the bases when I'm talking about this situation. I just think that as a modeler, as an amateur modeler, the rate of adjustment is pretty interesting. Because
Hmm.
if, let's say, Sartalp, I believe, has all the data, and I could perhaps request just specifically Spurs defense, it would be interesting to sort of chart, because I think Rob T does a similar thing for odds. He tracks how the odds progress
Throughout the week, yeah.
throughout the week.
Hmm.
So if we do a similar job of tracking the Spurs baselines throughout the season, I believe we should see a radical drop in both reviews rating of them and the market odds rating of them. So
Yeah.
it is I think the most interesting phenomenon I've seen this season in terms of model adjustments, because a few years ago, I think Gundogan was one of those extreme curiosities when he was playing in a very different position, and the models took such a long time to adjust to it that by the time they adjusted, it was done. He was back to playing the good old LCM role where he was not progressing as much as he was. So this in this case, I mean, again, there's some sort of grassiness in all of us, and looking at all the games and looking at the XGC that Spurs have, I'm not surprised, and I don't think you are either, right?
Yeah, I think, look, I mean, these kind of things happen when you just have like an incredible run of bad games, right? Like Liverpool in
Yep.
April or things like that. And you just have to expect that the baselines will shift in response to that. And another
Especially
thing
towards
too
the end
is,
of the
yeah, we
season,
also
right?
missed out on 2 weeks
Yeah.
of Spurs playing football as well at one point. So,
Yes.
um,
Yes. Fair enough. That's a great point.
but yeah, I think, it's a good segue to sort of my moves for this week, because my moves are to move Pau Torres out. And the question, I suppose, is with the additional cash that I have, I'm not limited by the 4.x options. I can actually go, that bit further towards Porro. So, what I'm noticing is obviously there was at one point a gap of around 1 EV between Porro and Burn in terms of what they were expected to deliver for this game week. But now it's like 0.4, 0.5. And then I'm suddenly thinking, you know, is there a world where I have excess money in the bank that
Mhm.
maybe I can better use for game week 37? But at the same time, I know I can't go to Salah in one free transfer from any of my players, with exception to maybe Son, who actually has Sheffield United away. So when it comes down to things like that, I'm not so sure of what the play is. And I don't think I just think for me, I haven't found an angle where there is a player in Gaming 37 that I desperately want so bad that would make me use the other 2 million that I have, between, well, not 2 million, but the 1 million, I suppose, between Paro and Burn, better on Gaming 38. So until I decide that, I suppose I'm still gonna have to sit with Poro. And another thing too is, at the end of the day, Poro still has higher even than Dan Burn. So one of the points too about adjusting to things is, obviously we see a trend that people are, team strengths, our eyes, I suppose, and models as well, are just adjusting to how bad Spurs are. But adjustments are there for a reason. We don't necessarily need to over adjust right after
Yeah.
that. So something that I'm keeping in mind, but we'll see how I end up with that move. And then I probably have to
So
go for a goalkeeper in Onana and Pope. But yeah,
I
sorry,
was
you
going
were
to
gonna say
ask
something.
you, no, I was going to ask you, which of these moves are you likelier to make in terms of combination?
I think I'm probably gonna do Pau to Poro, like for sure. And then the question for me is actually whether I go out of Gusto into Dan Burn, so to go for both defenders and to save myself from the questions, and keep Flecken, or I sell Flecken for Onana and Pope, and I take a gamble on Gusto, hopefully starting one game within the double.
Okay, so sorry, coming back to you were talking about Onana versus Pope for
Yeah,
this.
I think for me, obviously, Pope sounds like a ridiculous thing, but I think goalkeeper is always a little bit different. Like, you can either play, in my opinion. I'm not sure if maybe I'm wrong. Of course, that there is an element of match fitness as well, but I think that if Pope can maybe start a game, it's probably likely he can play two. Although actually, I'm thinking about Courtois as well, and our position as Real Madrid, and we've also sort of eased him in. We've given him one league game so far.
But
So
I think
yeah.
his injury was far worse,
It
right?
was far severe, and he
And there
actually had
was
two
and a
two
reoccurrence,
injuries as
right?
well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Not a
yeah,
reoccurrence, but for the other leg, right? So
exactly.
it,
Yeah,
it was I think it was perhaps the worst luck I've seen for a player this season. And
Mm-hmm.
when they were celebrating Joselu's second goal, I mean, he was sprinting all right. So, I mean,
Yeah.
hopefully he'll be back soon. But you raise an interesting point. So, for example, Courtois is likely not to play for Belgium at all in
Mm-hmm.
the Euros,
Yeah.
despite being on the bench.
But I think that's his choice as well, because
Yeah,
there's some spiciness
yeah, yeah,
behind the scenes regarding
yeah,
the captaincy of Belgium. But
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So coming back to Pope, just because it's a shoulder injury, I would be a little worried.
Mm-hmm.
But him being on the bench, I think just makes it so tempting, right? If
Yeah.
he were to be back, I think only someone in your position would go for him, because someone like me who's not on wildcard 35 already tripled upon Newcastle, and most wildcarders are also tripled upon Newcastle.
Mm.
So if anyone has the luxury, I think it's someone who has, let's say, triple Arsenal, and so hasn't had the time to go for triple Newcastle yet. So I would definitely consider Pope over Onana, just because even though in theory 20.1 XG shots sounds like a lot of saves, it still is 3 to 4 points at the end of the day, because Onana is not getting bonus points for that, because it would be a different thing if he's getting a lot of bonus points, right? But it's not that he's getting too many of them, unless he keeps a clean sheet, that is. So if you're depending only on shots saved, I am very skeptical about someone like Onana. But again, the Pope has to start, right? So if Eddie Howe does not give us an update,
Yeah, I'm not
how
going there.
likely are you to go for exactly?
Yeah,
You
I,
would
I
not
won't
go
go there
for it.
until Eddie
Yeah,
House just says, "Oh, Pope is starting
yeah, he's gonna
in
play.
gaming
Yeah,
37."
he's gonna
Yeah,
play. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
because I think also that would make Newcastle defense pretty enticing,
mm-hmm.
because Dubravka to Pope, I believe, is a pretty good upgrade
Yeah, yeah,
given how Dubravka has been playing. Because there was a version of Dubravka which was pretty close to Pope's shot stopping abilities, but somehow we haven't seen that. And that could easily be because of how they're playing as a team and stuff like that. But it's just that his PSXG has not been inspiring at all this season.
no, yeah, and he cost us dearly when he gave Solanke a lot of points on Game Week 25. So I'll remember
Oh,
that.
yeah. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. Coming to my moves, I am in a similar situation like Fran, albeit with one free transfer. I am looking to bring in a goalkeeper and a defender. So my two possible combinations are either I bring in Ederson and Pedro Porro, or the other combination is I bring in Vicario and Guardiola. And the second combination are both players that Fran already owns. So I know where Fran stands, because he's made the conscious decision of going for Vicario and Guardiola, and I think I agree with him. Just because Guardiola's minutes are criminally underrated on review, and they continue to be. It's still sub 70, which is so surprising to me how they are still sub 70. But the only thing that keeps pulling me towards Poro is Spurs' inability to keep a clean sheet. I just keep thinking, look, if I'm resigned to the fact that they are not going to keep a single clean sheet,
Right.
what's the point of bringing in their goalkeeper?
Mm.
That's the only thing that keeps coming to my mind, because on EV these moves are almost dead even.
Yeah.
There's, I think, point 0.2 EV difference between these two moves. So it's not a question of EV; it's just a question of personal preference.
Is that on
And
defaults or with adjusted minutes?
no, with adjusted minutes. With
Okay,
defaults, the first combination, Poro and Ederson, is 1.2 EV ahead,
fair.
but I adjusted Guardiola's minutes upwards, and so the gap close to around zero point 0.2. Now, the other discussion point, which I also want to get your opinion on, is Ederson. I have a suspicion that Ederson might not play all three games. And that suspicion is born out of the number of mistakes he has made this season. And also, if they win the league, then Scott Carson automatically becomes eligible for that one game that he
Yeah,
gets.
yeah,
So, I mean, game week 38 for anyone normally is not going to be a problem. For me, it is, because my second goalkeeper is Areola. And I am not going to play Areola against Man City in
mm.
game week 38. So from that perspective, Vicario automatically becomes the natural choice because he plays Sheffield United.
Right.
And I am just resigned to the fact that Pedro Porro is probably going to get some attacking returns, and I hope Guardiola can match them. And you'll be happy either way, because you'll probably own both of them.
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting point too, because I was thinking also like when it comes to Game Week 38, like would I rather have once again Ederson and Porro or Vicario and Guardiola? And I think I'd still think, yeah, on Game Week 38 I still think I'd have Vicario and Guardiola. So
even if Guardiola plays, I don't care because I have the bench, as we already said earlier in the pod, to cover someone like Guardiola missing out. But I simply don't have the bench to cover someone like Ederson missing out
It's a
because
great point.
yeah. So I think my decision is pretty much made. The only reason I'm deliberating is if there is an injury or something,
That's fair,
and
and we'll find out tomorrow as well. So,
yeah,
um,
absolutely.
but yeah, I
So
think
I
we've
would
touched on most of the good points for this week. Any
yep,
other sort of last
absolutely.
points on xMins you want to jump onto?
Not a last point, but just I would urge everyone to hold on
Yeah,
making transfers till as late as possible. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, yeah, whatever you find out tomorrow in press conferences can have consequences over 2 games of football as opposed to one. So
Yes.
even more
Yes.
important. And that's it, really, I think, for expense discussions. Let's move on to captaincy. But you did mention a point, actually, at one point in the episode, which was the idea that last season you were regretting the Wilson versus Isak captaincy. And I remember discussing that on the podcast. But also, I remember discussing with it to you privately, where it was one of those game weeks where it was very clear, I think, that the popular pick was Isak, but
Hmm.
that the very clear differential pick was Wilson. And now, obviously, as things turned out, Wilson won on expected minutes. He was also the player with, I think, better underlying stats per 90 because obviously of the impacts of us knowing whenever Wilson plays, Isak was a left winger at the time, so on and so forth, obviously being a bad thing for Isak. But, this season, I think the interesting thing about Game Week 36 is we all saw Haaland score 4 goals. First time in the Premier League that he's done it. And I think a lot of people overreacted to the Haaland captaincy for several reasons, right? This is it probably wasn't an awful week to go against Haaland captaincy, in my personal opinion. But I think a point that Dilksy also mentioned and he raised quite well on Twitter was the idea that closer towards the end of the season, this is game time, right? This is the time where you should be making more risk-based decisions potentially from a game theory perspective. What do you think about that? I mean, obviously you had a personal experience, so maybe you can just start from there. Last season, being put in a different position, obviously, compared to where you are this season. So yeah, what do you think?
Yeah. So first of all, Holland scoring 4 goals is such an anomaly even for him.
Yeah,
And you rightly pointed out that going against him was not a bad decision. Also because I think there was maybe 1% uncertainty about his X minutes. I still think it wasn't completely like okay, people are going to try to revise history now, but I just think it wasn't completely clear that he was going to play 90 minutes. I think that much is pretty clear.
I think that's fair. Yeah, that's very
Yeah,
fair.
yeah.
Yeah.
But again, him not playing 90 minutes does not correlate to him not getting points, which we all know and have known for 2 seasons now. Uh, Coming to my own experience, which was again Wilson versus Isaac last season. Firstly, I think the situation this season is a little different because I think Isaac Touchwood has proven to be much more robust with his X-Mins compared to last season. He definitely was much more flaky last season, and that was maybe an after effect of his Real Sociedad and his Borussia Dortmund days, where he was in and out of the team all the time because of injuries. This season has been different, so I have a different perspective for this season in terms of going Wilson or Isaac. Now, the risk appetite, as Dilixi has pointed out so eloquently, and I don't expect myself to be that eloquent, but I think the point that was being made was that the closer you get to Game Week 38, the less weeks there are for your potential risk to have negative consequences. So, for example, if you go for someone like Wilson and his X-Mins don't pan out the way you think, that decision is not going to cost you for 10 weeks because there aren't 10 weeks left. There's only 2 game weeks left. So decisions like these, I think should how can I put it? I think they're mocked unnecessarily, and always hindsight plays a part because once Holland scores 4 goals, all the discourse is, oh, how can you captain anyone else? There was never any doubt, but of course there was doubt. There was doubt from several places. There was again, if you subscribe to analytics, I'm sure people must have also thought about Newcastle because I was one of those who never truly believed. Of course, we spoke about this at length that there is definitely something going on with home versus away. But for one given game against a terrible defense, I don't think there was ever really a consideration for me that they were going to not score goals. And I think you agree with me there.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, Isak and Gordon were also pretty much near the top of your consideration.
Mm-hmm.
And so was Palmer, by the way, because Palmer at home against bad defenses has been
An
quite
awful
extraordinary.
defense. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
an awful defense, absolutely. And I still don't understand how Ariola managed to get me 3 points. That will forever remain one of the best things he's ever done this season. But coming back to what we were talking about, again, no, if someone had captain Nicholas Jackson, is that a decision where you say, okay, you made a pretty good decision, but if you captain someone like Palmer or you captain someone like Gordon, no, you made a bad decision. I don't agree with that. I think that your risk appetite should reflect, let's say, if you have some concrete goals. And people still play for mini leagues, right? And I think the true essence of FPL is still encompassed in mini leagues as opposed to overall ranks. So you and I will obviously always compete for overall ranks because if we are being frank, it's good for the podcast. It's good for the podcast. It's good for Fran's channel. And overall, I think having a good rank also means that you are less likely to be susceptible to bad decision making in future seasons. That's what I've learned from my own experience. Now that I'm almost certain to have a decent season, I think my decision making process has almost been solidified. And I can maybe filter out some of the bad elements even better. But from, let's say, an ML perspective or from a rank target perspective, I definitely don't think it's wrong to uh, take risks. Now, the risk appetite is a different discussion, right? Because the delta of expected value that you're willing to lose also matters here. So if you captain someone like Son, you were, I think, almost half, not half, but let's say 60% of Holland's EV, which is quite a substantial risk compared to someone like Palmer.
Mm-hmm. Or
I
Saka.
don't
Yeah.
think Palmer or Saka. Yeah, Saka is a great example actually, and the only reason I blanked on Saka is because I sold him, and I've just, I've been so badly punished by that. But see, that is one of the examples. Like I took a risk knowing that his ownership is sky high.
Yeah.
I went for Foden, and Foden did not start. Now I could absolutely lambast myself and say it was a terrible decision. Why did you do that and stuff like that? But no one knew Foden was ill and he was going to miss out. And
Exactly.
Luton was a prime fixture. No one can deny that as well. So I'm not going to change my decision making process because of that. The only thing I get from that is okay, look, I took a risk, it didn't work, and I got punished because I had an awful rank that week. I dropped from like 2K to around 6K. So yeah, I mean, I took a risk. It didn't work, and I was punished as a result. But somehow, when it comes to captaincy, it's different. When it's just deciding one player over the other, I think
Mm-hmm.
people find it more acceptable. But when you captain someone, just getting twice that player's point somehow plays a bigger role. I know I've gone on for a long time, but I also wanted to get your view
Mm.
on this whole discourse.
It's an interesting point you raise actually, because obviously when you captain someone, you know, your basic. It is actually a lot of EV, right? Because it's like
It is.
it is like almost like 15. You're pitting. Well, I mean, ultimately, obviously, the net delta in EV between another captain is not a lot, but I think it's about how much EV you own that's differential versus the field, right?
Mm,
Um,
mm,
and for me, I'm sort of reminded of my decision to wildcard on 26 because it was like a decision that I made knowing that I was in a good rank in the world, thinking that still I had a 100-point gap versus I think first place in the world. Probably the only chance I could actually realistically win was if I did something crazier. So I just decided to go wildcard 26 because I know most people wouldn't have done it. And obviously it hasn't worked out, although I've had a bit of a swing back since, so I'm not in the worst position in the world. But, you know, as you say, I guess I didn't have the threat, I suppose, of having a poor season the previous season either. So it's not like I felt
mm,
pressured to, I don't know, be a little bit more risk averse and sort of maintain the rank that I had. So I felt like I could have been a bit more aggressive. But then I think about little things too, and how people are discussing things. Maybe I was thinking this week too, like, was it too early for me to go differential on when we had maybe 13 game weeks, worth of decisions left? And it's something that I need to probably reevaluate when I have a bit more time in the off season. But as you mentioned too, obviously, as content creators, we have maybe alternative incentives as well, for specific decisions that we make in FPL, and it doesn't really always correlate to EV. It's more of like an emotional decision of whether I want to differentiate myself a bit more, and why I'm specifically going for the more risky approach at times, right? Or at the very least the differential EV approach at times. So yeah, something to think about. I would definitely. I don't think we're the type of managers to scoff at it, to be honest. It is funny I think, to react to outcomes. I mean, your name
Yeah, exactly.
should give it
Yeah,
away
exactly.
that we like doing it. But I think as competitive FPL players, let's be honest, you always want your team to do well, and by proxy of that, you hope that others do worse at times.
Yes,
It doesn't mean
that
that
is
we're here to give bad advice, but it also means, obviously, selfishly, we have goals for our own team and our own rank. So I
so,
think we'll,
sorry,
yeah.
I thought of something which is an interesting thought experiment,
Hmm.
which is what would you have estimated Holland and Palmer's EO to be at? Because
Mm.
I thought 175% was far too low for Holland because I was expecting something around 185, 190. And so
But I do
25%,
think Palmer has also been hauling massively, right? Like even leading
he
up
has,
to it. So
he has.
yeah.
So I did
If
expect
anything,
100
he was
plus.
the player who scored 4 goals, didn't he? So
Yes,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so I was expecting 100 plus or around 100 for Palmer.
Mm.
So one of the game theory decisions that you had to make was you could have looked at effective points, right? So uh,
True.
25% of what was it, 8 or 9 EV? What was it for Holland for Wolves? I think it was around
Uh,
9 if I'm remembering correctly.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah,
If you
because I
gave him, you're saying 90 minutes?
yeah,
Yeah.
90
Yeah.
minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So let's take 25% of 9 and compare it to something like, so it is 2.25, and compare it to something like how shall I compare it, 5% uh, points against for Palmer. So his EO is at 105%. I'm assuming everyone owns him, so for captaincy you would get 95% of his points. So if you do that experiment and you figure out the maths before deadline, by the way, so none of this matters after the deadline, but if you estimate some ownership levels and you do this exercise and you made a decision, there is no reason to doubt your process, because I think this is perhaps as close as you can get to a robust methodology for either going for a risky pick or not going for a risky pick. Because unfortunately, we do not have the luxury of estimating EOs accurately before deadline, which is quite obvious because only FPL knows what players' teams are before deadline. So until we have a better methodology for that, and I think there are fair few people who do have better ways of estimating what ownerships are going to be based on transfers in, transfers out, stuff like that. But until we come across that, I think this is quite a sensible approach that you just go for, okay, I believe I'm going to either get this many effective points or that many effective points. And obviously, if you captain the lesser EO player, your your ceiling in terms of risk is higher, and obviously the floor is lower because Holland is going to be massively owned. So this is an interesting exercise. I think if I'll try to see if I can at least get the numbers and post them as a comment on our video, because I just think it's an interesting exercise that people could go through for these last two game weeks and try to see if they can differentiate. By the way, before we move on to something else, we should probably go through just the captaincy choices because we haven't done that yet.
Yeah, sure. So obviously Holland, the leading choice. Um, and then quite a far distance is Son. And then actually, once again, further. So I would say if I tiered Holland as 1, if I tiered Son as 2, then I think there's a tier in of its own, which is De Bruyne, Palmer, Isak, and Foden all together, as a tier 3. So Holland's expected minutes aren't 90. I'll say that on review. If they were, there would basically be an S tier, and then Son would be a B tier pick, I suppose. So that would be almost 2 tiers of difference, I'd say. He will probably be the most dominant captain. His effective ownership will probably be also sky high. I imagine if anyone kept the triple captaincy, they'd definitely use it this week. And maybe actually that was why Holland's maybe his effective ownership could have been slightly higher last week. But, the point is here, for me, Holland is the clear captain to play if you own him. Um, what do you think?
Absolutely. I think I'm going to be captaining Holland
Yeah.
because I don't nearly care enough about my mini league. So there's one mini league where I would have loved to win it. I lost the lead because of Van der Ven and Garnacho, and there's like a 30-point gap now. And so I don't want to commit harakiri for something that's very unlikely to pay off.
Right.
And I was thinking about this week's EO estimates, and there could be three or more players who are above 100% EO. So we could end up in a situation where we are rooting for maybe only 6 to 7 players in our own team, which
You
would
really
be
think so?
pretty. I think Son, not Son. Okay, I think yeah. I might revise my estimation to, let's say, two,
Mm-hmm.
because I don't think Son is going to be over 100% because the after effects of him blanking for a couple of weeks is still lingering. So I don't think he is going to be above 100. Normally, when I think of Son, I automatically think, huge ownership, very popular FPL asset, and many people will captain him. But I don't think that's going to be the case this time around. It could be close enough to 100 that he would be irrelevant for us. But you're right. I don't think he's going to be above 100%. Palmer, I think, is definitely going to be above 100%. I don't see how he won't be, just because there will be people chasing either mini
Chasing
leagues
around. Yeah.
or rank tiers. So I think that will take him above 100 because he has to be close to 100% ownership anyway, even without effective ownership.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
I can't see how Palmer couldn't be basically just about there.
yeah, exactly, exactly. So you're right. I think three was too much. Two is more for conservative estimate. Yeah,
Yeah. To be fair, obviously, like, look, someone like De Bruyne is probably also a great pick for this week in terms of like the whole EO argument because he's probably like the least owned player,
yeah,
just from natural ownership, from even like elite pick players. So I think if you really want to differentiate yourself with that one decision of captaincy and you have a very reasonable team, I suppose De Bruyne is the best player to allow you to achieve that. But at the same time, yeah, because Arsenal have done us such a great favor, I think, in extending this title race and very fairly, because you could even argue they've maybe over the course of the season just been the best team in the Premier
absolutely.
League. Like, it's so hard to go against Holland right now. I think just when I had a quick check at all the captaincies with 90 minutes, which I think is very feasible for Holland, because it always goes back to little things like when we talked about Richarlison earlier on, like he can hit that upper threshold of better minutes. So even though people are sort of lowballing his minutes, like he could hit higher minutes as long as he's match fit. With De Bruyne, you'd have to say like he is more of that 75 to 80 minute player, even though we expect him to start both games. Haaland is someone who very frequently plays 90 minutes because he's young and because he's fit. And the same with Son, even though I wouldn't say he's young. So yeah, I think that's captaincy in terms of, once again, people going for differential moves. We don't scoff at it. This is the time to chase. And I guess one last question, like what are your realistic rank goals for the end of the season? Are you going to do anything crazy to attempt a specific rank, or are you happy with where you're at right now?
So I've unfortunately been busy with things outside FPL,
Yeah.
which hasn't been the case for a lot of this season. And so I would just want to be at whatever is the highest possible EV rank at this point.
Okay.
And I think the moves I see based off that, because and I was going to mention this before we close, which is that there is another move, which is Maddison to De Bruyne, and then locking myself out of Man City defense, and then going for Pedro Paul, which
That's
was the spiciest line I had looked at. So
that's
Madison to
interesting.
De Bruyne, what was the other one? Madison to De Bruyne, Zabarni to Pedro Porro,
Mm-hmm.
and then Neto to Onana or someone else, or maybe Pope. As not Pope, I can't go for Pope. But basically some doubling goalkeeper or just for Raya. So that would be the most spicy line that I have. Unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to be going for that because I don't see the value in taking another hit that you're talking about ceilings, right? With someone like Richarlison and the possibility of higher minutes.
Yeah.
I am also thinking about the floor with someone like De Bruyne and what happens if he's gassed out and misses out on one of the games.
Yeah.
So, of course, the comparison is Maddison, who is not starting any games. So, it's not a huge ceiling for someone like Maddison as well. But I just think the opportunity cost of 4 points might be too much for this. I'm still going to consider it a little bit. I might discuss this with you before deadline offline as well.
Yeah.
But I find myself unlikely just because I've never been this high in FPL as far as I remember. When I used to play only for mini leagues many years ago, I didn't care about overall rank, so wouldn't even know if I were higher than this. But consciously playing for OR, this is the highest, or not this, but uh, you know, many times prior to this, whatever rank I was at, it was the highest. So I don't want to compromise that. And once I have this, I don't know. I find it very funny that this would give me credibility, but in a weird way it does because it just is the case. I don't find it particularly fair, but unfortunately that is the case. And analytics has been having some ridiculous seasons. So we've seen for the past couple of seasons, it's absolutely ridiculous. And I don't know how this is persisting because this season started off in a fashion where we thought, yes, finally, analytics is not going to have a great season because the median ranks were terrible for, like, I think Gameweek 19,
Yeah.
20 or something.
Effectively until that wild
Yeah,
card 8 window. Yeah.
exactly. And then all of a sudden it plummeted, or I use Lucas's rank, so it went up depending on how you plot those graphs to even higher than last season, which is absolutely mental. And so we can't keep getting away with this is the sentiment I have. And so I want to take advantage of whatever I have accumulated. But that's a great question. Do you have any goals before we close out?
I think obviously because I was within the top 1,000 at one point, I'd like to squeeze in there. I just wonder obviously if my team's strong enough, in of itself to get there. Talk about spicy moves. I guess I still have room to go Saka to Richarlison. Um, and I can go Paul Torres to Dan Burn. And I
Okay.
can ignore Pedro Porro. And that would mean I just go Gaming 38 back into Saka. Do I want to do it? Not really, because I think that would be me putting myself in a situation where I have to be sure Richarlison plays like really good minutes. And I'm also in effect wasting a transfer for Game Week 38 for my team. So I feel like I'm not going to do it. And I think I have room to hope a little bit for the doublers that are my defenders, my goalkeepers, whoever I'm bringing in. Because when I look at, for example, like someone like Flecken, who I'm due to keep in that situation, if I go Richarlison, like, what is he going to do for Bournemouth, really? Like, away from home, So things like that are what I'm thinking about. And yeah, rank-wise, I think if I can squeeze into 1K, I think that's ideal for me. But as I said, something to evaluate about going for that much differential EV that early in the season. Maybe I think I'm also overreacting simply because it just went poorly for me, like particularly injury-wise, because I think not only did it hurt my team from a rank perspective, it hurt my team from just an EV perspective because I wasn't even able to grab that differential EV with the amount of injuries I had. But then I also think about, like people who've wildcarded over the last few weeks, like a lot of people have suffered too. Like even on wildcard 35, someone who maybe went Maguire plus Shar plus Bruno, you're already in an awful position
Yeah,
somehow,
I've
and you
seen
didn't get
people
any
who went
points.
for I've seen people went for Ben Davies as well, which
Interesting.
when he got the assist, they must have been delighted with that, and then that turned into an absolute nightmare for them
Yeah.
because price point again.
Yeah, and
So
even like
I
wildcard
do believe
30, all your defenders might be gone, like
yes,
your Gustos,
yeah,
your doggies of the world, and so things like that can hurt a lot of managers. But then it's also about like whether you have the players who also get points. And I think on Gaming 26, probably what I lacked is a single player who is the differential who could get me any source of points whatsoever. So, but yeah, I think rank wise, obviously, I think we've done extremely well this season. I
yeah.
can't really see myself dropping out of the top 10K. So I think whatever moves I make, hopefully, will just be additive. At least that's the perspective that I'm going to take. Because I think at the end of the day, we also have to think, a lot of people are going to take hits, right? Because they've had injuries. And another thing to mention too is not everyone had wildcard 35, right? So as a wildcard 35er, you're probably stepping into this game week with 2 free transfers. And the people who haven't wildcard, I think, are still due to make a lot of hits. And that was around 50% of the effective, playing population. So a lot of those managers are still bench boosting, but they will have to take a lot of hits to get close to sort of my team, where I sort of took my hits the week previous, and I'm not too worried, I think.
Yeah, but
So
you took a risk there, right? And that is something that could get easily
yeah,
you could easily forget about that because you took a risk of gambling on the fact that none of them would get injured.
it's true.
And
Yeah.
thankfully that is what has transpired. And so did I, by the way. I took a lesser risk because I only took a -8, but we both took a risk in that sense that we are gambling on not needing to make those same moves again or make moves in those same positions later on. So I think we would definitely do a deep dive after the season ends. I think compared to last season, we definitely are. I would say we have more clarity. That's the only thing I think that has changed in terms of explaining why we did what we did,
Yeah.
or evaluating it more fairly. I would say
No, that's
because
fair. I mean, this
maybe
has also been my
last
full first season with like
yes, yes,
analytics, I'd say, like under
yeah,
the belt,
yeah.
and also just trying to think about what my process is like, and the end game, I suppose, is like on a week to week basis, like what I'm comfortable with and things like that. So,
Yeah.
but the
So
podcast has
we can
helped.
quickly
Yeah.
go through. Absolutely. I mean, without the podcast, I think I would not never have thought about things from a different perspective, your perspective, and also from people reaching out to us, their perspective. It's been interesting. So definitely we'll look more into how we do recaps, and if we can get someone on like we did last season with FPL Mayor, we could try to get someone who has had a pretty high data rank. We know several of them, I'm pretty sure. So I think Fran is going to be one of those who's going to end up with a pretty good data rank. Let's see how Angeball ends up because he's going to suffer a lot this week
Mm-hmm.
in terms of MD. If he ends up in the top 50, we should definitely get him on. I'm just kidding. We can get him on regardless, but that would be a great incentive.
Yeah, I think he will. I
But
definitely won't. Yeah.
so let's quickly go through the chat. Thank you everyone for joining us. It's pretty late once again, so we appreciate anyone who joined. Joey Nicap says, can't listen live sadly. Just wanted to say hi and thanks for the great content. Looking forward to watching the recording later. Thank you, Joey, for joining us and also providing feedback. He's been the one who's given us good feedback, and we're trying to implement it the best we can. Flapjack says evening Flapjack. I think he's already gone by this point. Mr. Blanky says, which one to sell, Hoyland or Mateta? I mean, I would say Mateta just because there's no double for him, but
Yeah, I
and
mean, if
also
Bruno's out
Hoyland
as well,
can't be
Hoyland could
rested.
be on penalties.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
yeah, and
Okay.
Hoyland cannot be rested at this point because normally, if everyone is back fit, I would say he could get less minutes, not
Yeah.
be completely rested, but let's say 70 and 70. But we don't have players, so definitely don't sell Hoyland. Trini says, "Are we benchmarking this week?" Fran is, I know that, and I am not, which is a complete reversal of how we play the game in a regular game week.
Yes.
Just because I want to see how much my decision is actually going to net me as a visual representation. Obviously, I can calculate it by adding up the points. I just want a visual representation of how well it went. So I think Fran just wants to piss people off because there are people who really are the bench police,
Yeah.
and
Well,
that just makes you want to do
I
it
don't
more,
know
right?
what's wrong with the 5-2-3. It's a completely legitimate formation. So,
When I saw Gabriel in the starting 11, I laughed. It's so
yeah.
good.
Well, as they say, an Arsenal defender is better than two other defenses
Twice,
combined. So,
100%. I agree with you. If you do you want to take the rest of them?
yeah, go for it. So, another question is, Trini says, also Osaka Hall, well, it's not a question, it's a statement. Also, Osaka Hall versus Man United would hit like crack. I don't know if we're actually allowed to say crack on the podcast, but
No.
yeah, it absolutely would hit like crack. So yeah, I'll probably not go
Please.
Richarlison in order to
Friendly.
taste that crack. Nahuel says, hey guys, who are you captaining out of Son, Holland, Palmer? So I think we did actually go through this discussion eventually, but I think we're in a spot where we're pretty comfortable with Holland. But
Yeah.
I have to say, obviously if Arsenal made the title race less interesting, I'd definitely consider a captaincy swap. But because Holland is more than likely going to play 70 minutes, I think,
Mm.
bare minimum. I'm pretty tempted to just go Haaland and not be worried. And then Dr. FPL, responds to our thought experiment about a manager going Shara, Maguire, Bruno with his reality, which is owning all three of those players. All I have to say about that is you made the right decision. You went with the players with the higher expected goal involvement. But you just have to accept the realities of this game. It's pretty brutal at times, and I'm sorry about the
Yeah, and
lack of
Doctor
YouTube free transfers.
FPL.
Also, sorry. Shout out to all the managers who went for wildcard 35 because you're apparently not allowed to bleed EV when you wildcard late. What a shock that you can. Um,
That's
yeah.
gone really badly for most people, by the way. Um that's not shocking, but also I think it's a little unfortunate.
Sorry,
And
that is
we also have
satire.
had no, I know, I
Yeah.
know. And we've also had our fair share of bad game weeks
Hmm.
leading up to game week 36, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So definitely. And the only thing Dr. FPL I would say is worse for him is he's a United fan as well. So
Right.
losing Maguire and Bruno has been devastating for someone like him and for someone like me, but I don't own them in FPL, so it's not a double jeopardy.
Yeah, it's
So
an
yeah,
interesting too, because obviously, like, we tend to say obviously when one player has gone from a team in football that the team performance shouldn't drop off that much. But I think these are significant players given the state of their teams. So, um,
so Bruno Fernandes absolutely, and
yeah,
people keep talking about how he runs around aimlessly.
hmm,
It's not aimlessly, it's what the manager is telling him to do. Now
yeah,
the manager is aimless, which is a different discussion.
right,
But without him, there's nothing. There's actually nothing in that midfield.
hmm,
And
yeah,
I think yesterday or the weekend was a good demonstration on Monday, sorry, of people who want Bruno out, which those people are frankly off their rocker because I don't know how anyone can want him out of the team. I want him desperately. I mean, I'm closer to naming my kid Bruno than wanting him out of the team, if I'm being honest.
right.
So as he's absolutely the guy who is running our team right now, and we miss him badly.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I think that's it for this week. Thank you guys so much for joining the podcast. One more episode to go. Hope you guys have a lovely game week ahead. And I hope obviously all your decisions end in green arrows. And that's it for me. Signing off this week.
Yeah, have a good one, guys. Bye.